What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. It's actually quite shocking to see how long it takes for some Pokemon type combinations to be used again, but they do seem to be aware of this now and make more of an effort to try certain typings again. Scarlet and Violet not only gave us the first poison and ground type since Generation 1, but also provided another grass and water type after all these years. And the same Pokemon also adopts Cradilly's grass and rock, which is usually how I keep my Ogerpon because it's the best, but that got me thinking, which are the notable Pokemon type pairings that are still unique? However, notable doesn't mean good, because two types together can still be bad even if they are rare. So let's take a look at the top 6 best and worst, still unique type combinations in Pokémon. Number 6 worst, Rock and Dark. So right away we have a contentious one because many people love Tyranitar, myself included, but how a Pokemon can use a typing is only part of the equation. When you look at the raw matchups of the Dark and Rock pairing, you do have the immunity to Psychic, so that's nice, but aside from that, all Dark adds are the resistances to Ghost and Dark itself, while adding weaknesses to Fairy and Bug. Although you could argue that Bug doesn't really matter all that much because Rock can squish all of the bugs, but any good that it does is all cancelled out by both types being weak to fighting, only compounding that threat. Quad weaknesses are not always a death knell for Pokemon, and yes, Tyranitar can do decent work in spite of this, but it completely negates the immunity when you have such a glaring focal point from such a common attacking type. And even the lightest of vacuum waves could knock you down to the ground, especially when you're still weak to the likes of other common types such as water, grass, and ground, but tout resistances such as normal. So again, Johto's Green Godzilla is not outright terrible, that's why it's in this bottom spot on the list, but these types do not seem to mesh very well at all, and frankly it's just impressive how we've managed to go so long without seeing this type again. Number 6 best, Poison and Steel. Not lasting nearly as long on the list, Poison and Steel is brand new from the Paldea region, but long before this typing came to fruition, people did the math and saw how great it could be. It's got 6 regular resistances, 3 quad resistances, and an immunity to poison itself. And in exchange for all that, they only have a weakness to fire and a quad weakness to ground. That extra ground fault can be rough to watch out for, and I do find it funny that these Pokemon are weak to fire despite their internal combustion, but for Revavroom at least, it has the hidden ability Filter to further reduce the damage of super effective attacks. That being said, these Pokemon don't seem to really exemplify the combination of the types as best that they could be. I mean, it's a car that's not all that fast, and as a Steel type, it's only moderately defensive, so I would love to revisit this type again someday and make it not unique, but with it currently only being on one line, that makes it an easy addition to the list, narrowly beating out Heatran since the Lava Dome Pokemon has that extra water weakness. Number 5 worst, Ice and Fighting. I may hate Crabominable more than most other Pokemon, but I assure you this is not a personal attack. Ice is clearly a disgrace in only resisting itself, and Fighting also has a startling lack of decent resistances, only cancelling out the rock. But that leaves 3 resistances, one of them being Ice that Fighting would beat anyway, and 6 weaknesses, which as you may have noticed is double. Now it is true that the Yeti Crab would have super effective coverage over 2 of those types, but that still leaves more weak points than strengths. Now you might argue that I should factor in the offensive capabilities, to which I say I did, and that's why Mamoswine isn't in this spot, because Ground and Ice is one of the greatest attacking combinations out there, and the Twin Tusk Pokemon has fewer weaknesses with an immunity, so as hard as Crabominable can hit, those powerful punches lack credible threat with such abysmal speed and being weak to a third of the game. I kind of hope that we never see this typing down the line, because I don't want to see another Pokemon be as bad as this icy abomination again. Number 5 best, Fire and Water. It may be difficult to access only being on Volcanion, but water paired with fire comes out to a great type combination. Frankly, all of the starter types together create fun pairings, but I think fire and water might actually be the best of the 3. Each of the starter combinations cancel out to only have 3 weaknesses of varying types, but Volcanion nets the most resistances, with 3 of those 5 being a 4 times resistance. Now it is true that fire and water have the most common weaknesses with ground, rock, and electric, But powerful water attacks are easily going to handle the earth-related types, really only leaving electric as an area to worry about. Volcanion may be a mythical Pokémon, so it sort of skews the perception of this combination, but even without the legendary base stats, throwing these inherent opposites together make for a powerful mixture of elements. After all, they're about only one Gliscor away from being the Avatar, and that mastery is reflected in a remarkable combination to be used at any time. Number 4 worst, Rock and Dragon. I'll admit that I'm torn on including this one, but number 1, you gotta realize that there aren't a lot of unique typings left, so we're kind of limited on selection, and 2, Rock is just surprisingly bad. As far as the offenses go, it's one of, if not the worst, when it comes to power to accuracy ratios, since Rock moves are the most prone to miss, and the only really useful thing that it beats anyway is Fire. And then its defenses are compromised by having as many weaknesses as Grass, yet somehow never getting the flack for it. So adding Rock to Dragon just kind of brings it down. Again, there aren't too many awful unique typings left, and Tyrantrum is literally in my top 10 favorite Pokemon ever, but this prehistoric despot's stony exterior gives it weaknesses to the common Fighting, Steel, and Ground, with only some paltry resistances on the other side to Flying, Poison, and Normal. Again, it's not as bad as some shared typings out there, but the mandatory Rock for the fossils didn't really help out these Tyrannosaurus Pokemon at all. Number 4 best, Dark and Steel. Despite getting a new Pokemon under this banner, it was just an evolution of the existing Pokemon, so the combination is still contained to one line. And that's great for King Gambit because the Steel and Dark combination together make an excellent pair. This mixture results in 9 resistances with 2 immunities to Psychic and Poison, and in return these sleek-looking Pokemon only have weaknesses to Fire and Ground and a quad weakness to Fighting. That is a bit rough to deal with when it's such a common type, but there is the Zen Headbutt coverage that you can use, as well as various Rock and Ground attacks in their arsenal to cover the Fire weakness. Also, the difficulty curve of evolution is quite steep, but the sheer fact that these chess pieces resist well over half of the game makes it too impressive to ignore. You might be able to pack a karate chop or something if you're prepared, but without that preparation, you're likely to struggle in taking any of these Pokemon down. Number 3 worst, Bug and Fairy. This one may sound strange on the surface because when put together, Fairy and Bug have 5 weaknesses and 5 resistances with an immunity to Dragon. So it sounds like they slightly come out on top, right? Well, the same thing could have been said about Fire and Rock, but it was still bad too. We know that the Bug type is pretty egregious, and even when paired with a decent typing like Fairy, it can only be mediocre at best. Bug does bring resistances to Grass and Ground, but is that really worth the weaknesses to Fire, Flying, and Rock? Fairy attacks are resisted by Fire already, and the Bug moves aren't going to help you against the Fairy weaknesses of Poison and Steel because they already resist Bug too. So when you add a type that only really heaps on the liabilities with no way to counteract your initial weak points, I can only consider that a downgrade. Even if the Cutiefly line is pretty adorable with a nice signature move, they could still use some help before they would be considered great Pokemon. Number 3 best, Poison and Flying. It is truly impressive that we have made it all the way from the very beginning until now without a single new Poison and Flying Pokemon outside of the Zubat line. Sure, Crobat was added after the fact, but only in Johto, so it's still been well over 20 years since we've seen another venomous airborne creature. I guess their overexposure has made us a bit numb to it, but Poison and Flying is actually quite good. It is weak to 4 types, but on the other side there's 2 resistances, 3 quad resistances, and an immunity to Ground. It's worth noting that this combo quad resists Fighting as well, so if you have one of those quad weaknesses that we've already talked about, you can grab yourself a Crobat to pretty freely switch in and then easily take them down. But these bats also effortlessly get strong Bug attacks to take on their Psychic weakness, and even Giga Drain to take away the health of the Rock types that can set up Stealth Rocks. Not to mention the blistering speed, so the Zubat line takes steps to better balance out their weak points than most other unique typings, and they're so easy to pick up most anywhere, so assuming they'll continue to forego Poison and Flying in the future, these evil team favorites will continue to shine as unsung workhorses of the early to mid game should you decide to pick one up. Number 2 worst, Ice and Bug. I had this type pairing listed as one of the worst that had yet to be used, and then Galar went ahead and used it anyway, confirming all of my suspicions. I don't hate Frostmoth, it's a decent looking Pokemon, and I almost swapped out my Orbeetle for one in my playthrough, but the ice typing just made it too much of a downgrade. Sure, super effective coverage against Dragon, and especially Flying, is nice, but when putting Bug onto Ice, it only adds resistances to types that Ice already beats, and it results in 4 weaknesses. That doesn't sound too bad, but 2 of them are quad weaknesses to Fire and Rock, which used to be another of the worst unique typings before Generation 8 added more. When you're quad weak to the last guy who also had 2 quad weaknesses, that's pretty shameful. Especially when its stab attacks would hardly dent those typings that could take it out with a glance. And the woeful defenses and lacking speed on Frostmoth isn't going to help it survive much either, so I guess it's not all that hard to see why we haven't had this type revisited. Number 2 best, Water and Steel. I promise I did not intend to have Empoleon here, I'm not just including my favorite for no reason, but Water and Steel is objectively a great combination. It's basically the same as the Dark and Steel, with 11 resistances and only 3 weaknesses. It may only have 1 immunity this time, but there's no quad weakness, so there's not a single obvious threat. Yes, fighting and ground are quite common weaknesses, but the nice part about being water is that you get to blast away ground types with strong currents, and the Piplup line specifically, being birds, get plenty of flying type coverage to take on opposing fighting types, so this Regal Penguin is far from helpless. As it stands, this makes Empoleon one of the only starters to be able to resist Dragon, and also the things that can take out Dragon and easily be able to dispatch all of them. As a Pokemon, it's always been great being able to use a ton of HMs and be super helpful, but the types put together alone are so naturally brilliant that frankly I'm surprised they haven't touched it again, despite plenty of ideas that could be used. However, I am kind of glad that my wonderful Metallic Monarch remains so special even decades after its initial debut. Number 1 worst, Grass and Ice. Oh boy, here we are again. Honestly, I gotta give it up to Grass for not making up a lot more of this list, but to be fair, none of their other typings have remained unique over the years, so that just leaves Ice and Grass as the lone remainder, and unfortunately for Abomasnow, it's just plain awful. Not so much the Pokemon itself, I'm sure that they're doing the best that they can given the circumstances, and I actually quite like the execution of Snover a lot, but that can't hold back the avalanche of disadvantages that stack up against these Pokemon. Notably, it resists water, electric, ground, and grass itself, which, as you may have noticed, are all types that grass resists already, so ice adds nothing but canceling out the ice weakness. Well, that's not entirely true, because it does add weaknesses to steel, rock, and fighting, and cranking up the fire to be a quad weakness. For those keeping track, that is a spread of 4 to 7, with their most prominent attacks causing recoil, making it even harder to stay alive. Not even a Mega could help save this thing. The fire weakness alone is an Achilles heel, but it has so many other sore spots with very little that it can do against them. It even lost its one niche as the sole hail-setting Pokemon. So I don't want to insult these poor frosted trees for much longer, but being weak to over a third of the game without obvious upsides makes it pretty clear why this is still a unique combo, so as not to burden any other Pokemon with such a plainly bad type pairing. Number 1 best, Normal and Ghost. This is a sneaky combination that you wouldn't necessarily consider one of the best, but when you look into it, this pairing is scarily good once they finally pulled the trigger with Hisuian Zoroark. Putting Normal and Ghost together does make it weak to Dark, so watch out for that, but then it resists Bug and Poison, and it inherits Ghost's immunities to Normal and Fighting. However, it also gets Normal's immunity to Ghost. I'm pretty sure this makes it the only Pokemon that's totally immune to itself, unless you count shenanigans like abilities, I suppose. The reason that Psychic and Normal was so exciting at the time was because of that Ghost immunity and canceling out the fighting, leaving only Dark again. But with Ghost on its side, it has that same setup, but with 2 more immunities. That is insane to be untouchable 150% more than you're susceptible to attack. Not that there aren't still tons of neutral hits that you can use against it, but any types that resist Normal are hit neutrally by Ghost, at least ever since Steel lost that resistance in Generation 6, and of course, firing off super effective Ghost attacks against an opposing Spectre, only to have their moves pass right through you, would be every Hex Maniac's worst nightmare. And vice versa, with Dark being the only weakness, it can use any number of powerful stab normal attacks to defend itself. Or of course the plentiful fighting moves that the Illusion Fox can equip in its moveset. As funny as it might be that the original Zoroark is the only weakness for its relative from the ancient past, I think it's pretty clear that Normal and Ghost is a phenomenal typing, and even with the relatively frail Zorua line being the only one so far, I shudder to think of when they decide to make a defensively focused one. May Helix have mercy on us all that day. But those are what I believe to be the top 6 best, and worst, still unique type combinations in Pokémon. Which one-off typings do you think are most noteworthy? Which ones would you like to see again? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded.